Welcome to AEC Unscripted M&A Edition, your go-to podcast for unfiltered conversations and expert analysis. Brought to you by Stambaugh Ness.
Welcome to AEC Unscripted. I'm your host, Jeff Adams, the Director of Mergers and Acquisitions at Stambaugh Ness. Today, we're going to be exploring M&A from a legal perspective through the eyes of an attorney. And I'm delighted to have joining me for this episode a man who needs no introduction to those of you participating in M&A in the AEC industry, George Christodoulo. George is a corporate lawyer with Lawson Weitzen who has spent over 45 years in private practice in Boston. He has extensive experience providing legal services to AEC firms on a national basis. He has an emphasis in ownership transition, mergers and acquisitions, fiduciary duties of directors, and professional licensure and termination of principals. He has completed over 300 transactions among AEC firms in U.S. and Canada, representing both buyers and sellers. George, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, I appreciate that introduction, Jeff. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
So, George, when it comes to M&A, I think it's safe for us to say this is not your first rodeo.
Actually, it isn't, and actually the 300 is now 400 transactions.
Now 400. I can believe that. I know I've seen you out there a lot, speaking at a lot of different conferences. I've seen you, working different deals, both representing buyers and sellers. And a matter of fact, I think when I first met you, it was when we sold the firm I was with,
Right.
and you were engaged. So, you've been out there a lot, doing a lot in the industry. So always great to get to connect with you.
Well, what's happened in the last maybe 10 years is the space has gone from 200, 250 transactions a year 6 or 8 years ago to 300, 350 transactions a year over the last 3 years, or actually last 5 years, and now the last 3 years, and the prognosis for 2024 is 400 to 450 transactions.
There's definitely a lot going on in the AEC industry when it comes to M&A, and I don't think we're seeing any end in sight when it comes to that.
And we're seeing more and more private equity firms join in also.
Absolutely. We actually had a private equity firm on our last episode of the podcast, and we'll have more to come. But George, briefly tell us about your background and how you ended up being a well-known M&A attorney in the AEC industry.
Along with getting a law degree, I got an MBA. It was a special program. 4 years, you get 2 degrees, but you pay for 5 years tuition. Then I joined a medium-sized law firm in Boston as a corporate transaction lawyer. And back after a few years in the early 80s, I had a colleague who represented architects and engineers in professional liability defense matters. And of course, there was no any M&A practice to speak of at the time. And he had a client who was engaging in an internal transition and suggested that the employees there get counsel, and I transacted that deal and closed that deal. Of course, there was no playbook, so it was a little bit of finding our own way along here. Then another matter came up. Then I was referred to another small transaction. And then over the course of the next maybe 10 years, I spoke at a PSMA seminar and an AEC seminar and an AIA white paper and an AIA conference, another professional liability conference on the topic of mergers and acquisitions, because the total number of transactions, both internal and external, was heating up. Mm-hmm. So over a period of time, word got out. I sort of rode the wave of more deals. A book was published in M&A that I was the author of. Then there was a second book published. Then there were more conferences. People were getting mostly strategics to strategics. And then along came some public companies that went across the country buying up firms. So the number of transactions was heating up. And many firms were facing the reality that internal transition was very difficult to not only scope out, but to implement, and turning to mergers, if you will. Some of these were acquisitions, some of these were mergers, some of them were defensive coming together. But the number of transactions kept growing and growing and growing. And therefore, now we're at this 400, 450 national deals a year. We probably do 8 to 10% of all those deals right now, 35 to 40 a year, which is a large number compared to where we started. We have
Yeah,
a team.
absolutely. So George, what size deals does your firm work on typically?
The size of deals that we work on is reflective of the size of deals in the space. This year to date, we have done a $75,000 architecture to architecture merger, a defensive merger, maybe call it, where two local firms got together. That's sort of on the low side. $150 million on the high side this year. Last year, we did over $200 million. That's private equity coming in the third round of buying a firm that's already been recapped twice, and everything in the middle. I would say, as a generalization, we've seen most of the deals in the $15 to $50 million range, because that's reflective of the size of deals. There are allegedly 70,000 firms out there. So it's the biggest firms, second or third recap. Those are the ones that get the 9 figures. But most of the firms are in the middle range, first or second recap.
Yeah, well, that seems to kind of coincide with what we see out there in the industry when it comes to AEC firms, where well, we know when we're talking about architects and engineers, there's, depending on who you're asking, around 100,000 or so firms. And I've heard statistics that like 80 to 85% of those have 15 employees or less. So when you
Correct.
you start looking at that mix and thinking about, okay, who's being sold and going through that, there's a wide array. And as you show through your numbers that you just put out, that you guys cover the gamut.
I would say, as a generalization, the architecture deals are smaller because there are many more smaller architectural firms. Though we're starting to see smaller engineering firms, people who have been working on an internal transition, what we'll call an intergenerational transfer, not intending to sell to a bigger firm, but then getting approached. And the synergistic benefits, the financial benefits, the business acumen benefits of joining a bigger platform become compelling for the firm. We are not intermediaries. We get involved at some point in the letter of intent process when there is a discussion going, but there are several firms out there that are just looking to place their investment money, especially the private equity folks that have invested in the space.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there too, George, and it's something you just said that I wanted to ask you about. At what point, I get asked this question all the time by sellers in particular, at what point should I engage my M&A attorney? And you just mentioned somewhere during the letter of intent. Could you just expound upon that a little?
Absolutely. The letter of intent, which usually follows either an approach by a prospective buyer to a prospective seller, an unsolicited approach, or letters of intent can be solicited by intermediaries working on behalf of the seller. And now we're seeing a third channel, whereas the prospective buyers are literally cold calling firms and asking if there's any interest in having a preliminary discussion. But those are what we'll call the discussion phase. The letter of intent which of course is not binding, represents, if you will, a blueprint of outline of the form of the deal, the compensation in the deal, the employment arrangements post-closing, the integration concepts where you fit where you're standalone or you're joining an existing platform. That is absolutely the stage where we should get involved and should get involved, because although the LOI is not binding, most buyers view the LOI once signed as pretty much an agreed upon outline of a deal, financially, the form of the deal, which of course has tax ramifications for the buyer and the seller.
Mm-hmm.
So we do our best work if we get involved at the LOI stage. Otherwise, if the LOI has been signed, then you're asking me to mechanically close a deal that I had very little input in negotiating. And what we find in those circumstances is often we have to go back and tweak the LOI because the LOI has not covered things like the taxation, or whether this is an asset deal or a stock deal for tax purposes, or a so-called 338H10 deal, or F-reorg, or is this a merger? Has anybody thought about the state licensure laws? You can't do this in North Carolina or New York. So the rush to signing an LOI often leads to having to not unwind, but do a substantial remake of that LOI to make sure that both the buyer and the seller understand all those concepts, and of course the professional licensure aspects, not to mention the tax aspects. So the money spent up front before the LOI is signed to bring in a good tax advisor and a good legal advisor on both sides, by the way, on both sides, is money well spent, so that when that LOI is signed, that the parties have some level of confidence that we've covered most of the structural issues. And then now we deal with getting together in the due diligence and the documentation. But that's a very important first step. It's a little bit like asking someone to build a building when they didn't have any input on the plans.
Mm-hmm.
And we often, it's often it leads to a much better and smoother process if a little time and effort is spent up front with the legal teams of both sides and the financial teams of both sides, making sure there are not any major impediments or hurdles to closing the deal as proposed.
Well, your response to that question should sound very familiar to clients that Stambaugh Ness has represented as an intermediary. That's what we tell them all the time, is that while the letter of intent is a non-binding contract, it is the handshake agreement that both buyer and seller are making each other. And we advise them to include in that letter of intent any kind of what I call deal breakers, those things that really matter to the buyer and seller. Get those in the letter of intent, because the last thing you want to do is go through the time, the money, expending all the resources you have to during the due diligence process, only to get to the 11th hour to realize this thing is going to fall apart because of something I could have addressed when I was negotiating the letter of intent.
I couldn't agree with you more. Oftentimes, senior owners don't want to stay 5 years. They're older. They want to stay 2 or 3 years. Am I a platform issue topic? Meaning, am I, the firm, going to be the platform, the name, or am I getting folded in? I mean, there are a lot of topics that should be addressed and discussed at the LOI stage, because once that LOI is fully vetted and signed, it's a much smoother process. And remember, this is not a them and us against each other. We're trying to make a marriage here. We're just trying to help the firms get to their agreement to join together.
George, you mentioned the intermediary term a couple of times a while ago and noted you're not an intermediary. I responded a moment ago saying, Stambaugh Ness is an intermediary. What's the difference? What's the importance of having an intermediary and an attorney?
Well, we don't do what intermediaries do, and intermediaries, by and large, don't do what we do. Okay, an intermediary.
You and I know that. Let's explain that to the buyers and sellers out there.
An intermediary would go to a seller that is engaged typically on some kind of an arrangement that has some payments for work and then a success fee, and will counsel the seller as to folks in different firms that might be available and might be interested in, and run a process, meaning to put together something called the SIM, a confidential employment informational memorandum
Mm-hmm.
that describes the firm, describes what they do, how many people, where they are geographically. It can run from 10 to 30 pages, depending on the firm. And then that some kind of a cold teaser without identifying the firm is sent out to a number of folks that are vetted. The firm and the intermediary have decided that this group of firms likely will have an interest in at least discussing an acquisition because of the size of the seller, the kind of work they do, where they are geographically, all the above. And then there's a process where there's interaction between the prospective buyers and the seller. They discuss, talk, maybe they'll ask for a preliminary IOI and a indication of interest. That's not an LOI, but it's sort of like you get a feeling for the kind of financial remuneration involved. You get a feeling for where you fit into the organization of the buyer, etc. And then from that, discussions ensue. Legal comes in, maybe starts to mark up the LOI, which is going to follow the letter of intent, with a handful of prospective buyers. And there's an interaction that leads to 1, 2, 3, or 4 or 5, depending upon the number of interested parties engaging in that process, usually whittled down to 2 or 3 if you're
Mm-hmm.
a fortunate seller, and then 1. And the more fulsome the letter of intent is, the more specific it is, the more likely there will not be any surprises post signing the LOI. Signing the letter of intent is very important. The buyer believes they have a deal, and the seller, because there's an exclusivity provision in the letter of intent, is off the market. And that's a very important point, because that means that one of the prospective suitors that was interested calls you, the intermediary, and says, hey, we haven't heard back on ABC Engineering. And the answer has to be, well, ABC Engineering is not in a position to talk to you anymore. So that's code for somebody else has an exclusive arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the buyer goes off, those buyers go off to somewhere else. Okay. And then, and the buyer who signed the LOI knows darn well now they have an exclusive. And that's when the firms, the buyer and the seller who have signed the LOI, commence the due diligence process and get serious. And they're going steady now, and they're hoping to get married.
Absolutely. Now, I appreciate that, George. Once you get into the process where you're post LOI now, and we're going through negotiations, starting to draft the purchase agreement, employment agreements, and all, what's generally your relationship that you see between the attorneys and the intermediaries?
We always want to be working with intermediaries if possible, because we're here to close the deal. We're typically not negotiating sensitive points with the buyer via the seller or vice versa. The intermediary is that communication link. We don't want the buyer and the seller facing off face to face on any issue. We want the seller talking to the intermediary with counsel from the lawyers, talking to the intermediary or buyer on the other side, so that we keep the principles from butting heads.
It's very important. Absolutely.
A back channel, if you will, because lawyers, and it depends who the lawyers are on the other side and whether it's a buyer or seller that we've done work with. so that we know the lawyers. Some of these documents start with a very aggressive approach. Others are more attuned to the marketplace. We can tell you what restrictive covenants are normal and reasonable in this space, what kind of tax indemnifications, okay, et cetera, et cetera. So, but there has to be a back channel. It's very important to have a back channel. So we keep the buyer and seller talking kumbaya, we're getting together, and having the professionals, the intermediaries, the tax accountants, the tax advisors, the accounting advisors, and the legal. We're here today, we're gone after the marriage. Okay, so it's important that they be the source of going back and forth and keeping the buyer and the seller not facing off on issues.
Yeah, that's what we tell our clients all the time, George, is that, they're the ones going forward. They're the ones that survive post-closing. It's the buyers and the sellers and their relationships of utmost importance. So I generally tell my client, let us play the bad guy. If there's something that needs to be pushed on your behalf, let us be the one to do it. It's not necessarily important that the other side like us.
Well,
Now,
in fact, in fact, I'd rather take the heat and let the seller be viewed more positively, and have the seller say, well, that's my advisor telling me this.
absolutely. George, let me ask you this question. As far as the buyer attorney is generally the one who writes the first draft of the purchase agreement based upon the letter of intent that was negotiated. Do you think it's important that the seller, and so let's say buyer and seller, is it important that both have an attorney that is experienced in M&A? I hear that question all the time.
To me, there's no question about it. In fact, I once asked a prolific seller who was going across the country buying firms. We happened to do 2 or 3 deals on the other side of South Counsel. We were actually staying in the same hotel back in the days when we did things in person, and they invited me over to the breakfast after we went through the Marriott buffet, and we were talking, and I said, so what's your greatest challenge when you're at the LOI stage and you get it signed? And they said their greatest challenge was that the seller hires accountants, financial advisors, and legal advisors who know nothing about the space. They would much rather butt heads and discuss real topics that are important to both than have folks that are new to the space. A, they talk about topics that are not relevant. B, they're not conversant on the topics that are relevant. And we get off on issues. Well, I'll give you a quick example. The other day, I had a client, and their accountant said, well, this is an asset deal, but you, of course, keep all your receivables. Well, the LOI was just the other way around, and I don't know where that came from, but now we have to work backwards. We have to unwind. We have to unwind that advice. So we would rather talk. In fact, the best deals, the smoothest deals, are the ones where the buyer's counsel, seller's counsel, the intermediaries, the tax advisors all know each other.
I see confusion. The example you gave there, I see that all the time around networking capital. Who keeps the cash? Who keeps the receivables? Who keeps the WIP? What happens to the payables? And you hear all sorts of different answers out there in the industry, people not understanding how that works. And so, yeah, definitely.
The LOI is so important because that's the time to discuss it, not in the drafting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me ask you one follow-up question on that. So we were kind of talking along the lines there of, is it important that you have attorneys on both sides that are experienced with M&A? What about having your M&A attorney be experienced in AEC? How important is that?
In my mind, it's absolutely critical. There are a few firms across the United States with various levels of involvement in the AEC space. What we see when we have a platform company, that is a firm that is big enough, a seller that's big enough that a private equity firm is going to come in and make it their platform. And hence, after that, other firms will be tucked in or rolled into that firm, that platform. And those are the folks that typically are larger law firms, national law firms, 1,000 people, who are not necessarily conversant in the AEC space. Those are challenges. Challenges because they take positions that just don't work and we know it's market here. We've done enough deals. And candidly, they miss stuff. They miss things like professional licensure in New York, North Carolina. They miss sort of topics. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's a topic that everyone has to address and solve. And in fact, sometimes we get called by those law firms to work for them, to help them on the licensure, for instance, because professional licensure in the AEC space, as you know, is very complicated in many states.
Absolutely. No, thank you, George. I couldn't agree with you more on that too. Let me ask you this question. I'm kind of shifting gears a little bit. What are some of the more common issues you've seen arise during M&A deal negotiations in the AEC space?
Oh, and we counsel sellers all the time to clean up their house, okay? The quality of their financial statements, the quality of their stock ownership books. They promise stock, phantom stock to people, but they're not documented. Their shareholder agreement is not complete or cover mechanics, their compliance with laws. They sign contracts, sellers sign contracts with outrageous indemnification clauses in them because they don't vet them. They've got a poor record of professional liability claims. We had one deal where workplace safety claims were so great that their rating was so bad that the deal stopped right in its tracks. We see the commingling of personal expenses of the senior principals of the target firm, cars, entertainment, I've seen landscapers, boats, docks, baseball tickets. And I'm not talking tickets, I'm talking luxury box for the whole year. Old AR, failure to run in a business-like manner, commingling of some assets, or the quality of the P&L statement. So if we get in early enough, we advise our seller clients with their advisors to do their own scrub. In fact, now a lot of sellers are doing their own quality of earnings studies. They'd rather pay a princely sum to get a quality of earnings done, so they have an idea of what life after signing an LOI might be like. They don't want to go sign an LOI and then find out that although the price looked good, the multiple on the earnings is going to be very different because of the due diligence the buyer does.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting shift that we are seeing, where the sell side is coming in doing their own quality of earnings. And I think it's a great thing for them to do. George, you mentioned if you get in early enough to help them ready themselves for sales. When is early enough?
Long before, it's when you've got an intermediary, a financial advisor, when that firm presumably goes and gets a good tax advisor. Those are different now. One is advising on the deal, the other one is telling you about the earnings and the real tax and accounting. And that before you go to market. And that's especially important today because the number of buyers that are either private equity or private equity backed firms have turned the focus to not just synergistic services that are being rendered in the right territories around the United States, but also we'll pay 8.2 times your trailing 12 months EBITDA. Well, everybody thinks that's great until the seller and the buyer can't agree on what that 12 months is like.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking tens of millions of dollars in some point. So to me, the seller who spends the time and the money up front gets a beat on what the end product's going to be, is not disappointed having gone through this, thinking, I thought I was going to get X and I got X minus Y. And I'm also seeing, though, that sellers are getting more sophisticated about how the deal works, the deal steps work, and are willing to spend some time and money and effort to sort of clean up their house and present to the buyer, if you will. I guess the analogy would be like you're putting your house on the market, but you can just put a sign for sale, or you might get some professionals come in and stage the house and clean up some of the rotted wood and make sure that there are no showstoppers in the foundation and the roof.
Absolutely. We all understand that from a home selling viewpoint, right? And I think it's always a great analogy to put over into the world of M&A, because there's a lot of similarities. I think we see this, we talk about that, and the other analogy you hear a lot is that you referred to earlier, is kind of that dating process, right? And it's a marriage of two firms that's going to happen. So that whole process of dating, getting to know each other, and moving to the next step, and ultimately to a marriage, is really what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've been talking a lot about objective factors, legal factors, numerical factors, but I see the really, really attuned buyers spending a lot of time getting the seller leaders excited about what we can do together. Okay, you're not big enough to go after that project, but together we are. Or you are subcontracting 40% of your prime contract because you don't have those
Mm-hmm.
in-house abilities. We do. So 1 and 1 might make 2.5 there.
Yeah, that's what
And
we say here all the time. Yeah. Where
and
one
and
plus one equals more than two, right?
yeah, and I so if I gave the impression that it's not just numeric driven, I apologize. It's the private equity numbers that are coming in that are so compelling that some folks just jump for the number and don't talk about what life after it is going to be, whether things are going to change, or I'm just supposed to go out there and get more work.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times it's in our human nature just to want to see that number, know what it is, lock in on that. And I try to encourage my clients, let's try to delay on that number a little bit, because it makes things confusing. Focus on that culture. Make sure you got a great culture fit. Look for that strategic alignment, like you're talking about, where you can have these top side synergies on the revenue side, where when you put the two firms together, 1 plus 1 does equal something more than 2. And generally, when you find the right fit on those two aspects, the money tends to follow.
Absolutely. And I find a lot, I think the best buyers are the ones that lead with that discussion of how we can work together and be a better firm, and not with, well, let's get in a bidding war. Somebody just bid this much EBITDA, I'll bid this much EBITDA. I won, so I'm the winner. Okay, remember, this is your profession. You went to school to be a professional. You want to practice your profession. It's okay to take some monetary benefits off the table. It's okay to get rollover stock if that's there, but you still want to go to work every day and practice your profession.
Absolutely. George, how often do you hear of deals or legal issues, let's say, arising post closing? And what are some of those issues?
Well, luckily today, with the electronic age and due diligence being electronic, and gone are the days where cardboard boxes showed up with lots of documents and people didn't read all of them. I would say there are very few that really have a lack of success or a failure label on them. Um, Sometimes if the deal is warranted, there's a earnout. An earnout simply means part of the purchase price is going to be paid based on post-closing performance, and sometimes that earnout performance doesn't quite make it. That could lead to disappointment, even though it was written down. Once in a while, I see a personality, not a misfit, but it doesn't work out quite the same. A firm sells to a firm that is buying 2 or 3 firms in the same space and putting them together, and each of the 3 sellers thinks they're going to be the head of the firm. Well, only one of them is. But I have to tell you, from a legal point of view, we don't see many surprises. Professional liability insurance is covers any professional liability claims. The advent of so-called rep and warranty insurance, representations and warranty insurance, in many deals means that the buyer and the seller together buy an insurance policy that really eliminates, by and large, the likelihood of indemnification claims. Post-closing, false or incomplete representations by the seller. So once in a while, there's a tax issue. But the only thing I can tell you that regularly shows up, and I have no idea why it is after a closing, there'll be some professional liability claim that comes out of the woodwork for something. Okay. But if you buy insurance, that's just a risk of the profession. But I will tell you that we've come a long way in the vetting of due diligence, in the terms and conditions, in the insurance. We had D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance, cyber insurance, employment practices insurance, errors and omissions insurance, fiduciary insurance. So we, knock on wood, have not seen a lot of those claims. And when they do, they were usually anticipated by the use of insurance, so they don't become divisive, because no buyer wants to walk down the hall and tell their seller, who is now head of some large division of their work, that they have a problem and they're going to have to bring a lawsuit. That is not a good day in the neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to this tail insurance, I've seen where there's the typical 3-year tail insurance policy that the seller pays for related to their firm, that basically covers any claim that arises up to 3 years post closing that relates to any work that was done pre-closing.
Right.
But then there's also times where you see the buyer says, "Hey, I'm just going to extend my policy over to you and cover you that way." And I can't remember what that term's called when they do that. Have you seen that, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, first of all, you're right to say that the seller pays for it, but I will tell you, in more than half of the deals now, buyers are offering to pay for some of that insurance. If it's a competitive bid and I got to find a way to put more money on the table. Okay. I have, and there are challenges. A typical target would be smaller. So let's say they have 2 million, 5 million, or 5 million, 10 million, 5 million, a claim, 10 million, whatever. And a deductible of $150,000, 200,000. Rolling, some buyers say, just come under our policy. Well, the problem is our policy has a $500,000 deductible. Okay, now they may have 3 times as much coverage, and then the question becomes, who's paying that deductible when the claim comes up? Okay, so it's we've had a lot of different scenarios there. Sometimes the buyer says, "No, seller, you keep your policy in place. You buy the 3-year tail, and we're going to insure." As you know, you can't have 2 insurance policies at the same time, but we can insure over as a backup insurance. But that's not that is not to be interpreted as a way around. It's interpreted as getting the two insurance carriers on the phone with some people who understand insurance speak and trying to work out what makes sense, because the first thing you want to do is make sure there's adequate coverage. Secondly, you want to make sure no one's going to get hurt if there is a claim, or if you are going to get hurt, we know how much you're going to get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a very sophisticated discussion that candidly is really not between the buyer and the seller. It's between the buyer's insurance folks and the seller's insurance folks. And often we're on that call trying to make sure that the deductibles and the coverage line up appropriately.
Well, and I think you make a great point out there for a seller that when they're looking at the cost benefit, when they have that option of going either way, tele insurance or rolling over to the buyer's insurance, don't just look at the premium cost, right? There is that deductible piece to consider. Should a claim arise, that needs to be negotiated.
And that's why we tell our seller clients to have a seller's rep account with several $100,000 in there, because the one thing I can assure you is there'll be a claim. Okay, I can't tell you why, but there might not be a worthwhile claim, but there will be a claim in the 3 years. And so let's not pretend that it's not going to happen. Let's just understand what the scenario is when it happens.
Absolutely. George, what can a future seller be doing right now from a legal perspective to position their firm for sale?
They can be scrubbing, and more now. Like, we have a client that's going to market, and they came to us last year, and they have a myriad number of not issues, topics they weren't sure that they were really up to snuff on. They had an offshore company. They did work in some licensure restricted states. They wanted us to scrub what they had done with their local attorneys, their management services agreements, their shareholder agreement, wanted to understand their phantom stock program. They had set up a non-IRS sanctioned program. There's nothing wrong with that, but they want to understand the tax ramifications. Sometimes sellers come and say, well, we want to give out bonuses right before the closing to reward our people. And then we brought in an accounting firm to do a so-called 280G analysis, because if stockholders get disproportionate bonuses before the closing, there's a legal concept that those could be ordinary income, or you can't make them unless the shareholders bless them. So there are a number of tax, licensure. I will tell you, licensure still remains problematic. Well, we do work in North Carolina. Well, you license. Well, we're not licensed there, but we got a guy there who's licensed. Well, that's not going to pass the due diligence smell test for the buyer. We see, where's your S corporation election? Well, we've been in S corp for 20 years. No, where is the S corporation election from the IRS? Well, it doesn't exist. You can get it, except it's better to get it before you go to market than to be asked for it by a bunch of accountants and tax folks from the buy side, who now are going to say, well, there's a little sloppiness there. We better dig more and more and more. So it's getting your house in order. It's cleaning up and old receivables. Doesn't mean you have to write them off, but you just run your business more business-like. So a good accountant, a good tax advisor, and a good transaction lawyer for pennies on the dollar can help you clean up your presentation before you go to market. And that's important for a couple of things. First of all, you clean it up. And secondly, the buyer doesn't get the impression that there's sloppiness, because when they get an impression that not everything is just dotted the I's and crossed the T's, they tend to look more now, and they tend to look deeper. They ask for everything, and today with electronic due diligence, it's pages and pages and pages. And so we know what they're going to ask. 35% of our work is on the buy side. I can tell you what the questions are. So why don't we do them now? when we have time to not fix them, but clean them up,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that is. These aren't bad issues. It's just they're distractions. And again, back to the house analogy, if the house looks like it's well cared for, then maybe you're less likely to look about the rot under the tiles. Okay, so that's what you should be doing. It's not a lot of money. Financial quality. Are you in QuickBooks? Okay, virtually no firm in this space is GAAP compliant. Some of the folks don't even understand what GAAP means. That doesn't mean you're going to become GAAP compliant, but it means a good scrub of your financials. Revenue recognition is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so spend some time and money with the tax advisor, not just the folks that do your taxes. I'm talking about a transactional tax advisor. Get all that ready. You know the due diligence barrage is coming. So what I'm saying is get it done ahead of time and be ready for it. Because that's going to serve the seller well, no matter who the buyer is. And candidly, sellers have enough trouble during the post-LOI stage in dealing with buyer requests, running their firm, meeting about integration, talking about kumbaya after the closing, that they don't have a whole lot of extra time to be doing this. And they have to do this because if you don't get through this period, your rep and warranty insurer, your private equity sponsor that's got tons of accountants and MBAs looking at things, is going to find all these topics, and it's going to delay the closing. It might typically could sour the buyer a bit. So if we know what's coming, use your advisors to tell you what's coming and address it now.
Absolutely. George, you mentioned the whole state advisory issue. I just want to highlight that a minute because we see that a lot. Stambaugh Ness has multiple arms, and one of those is a state advisory group. And from time to time, they get engaged on M&A deals post M&A. We weren't involved in it as an intermediary and going through that process and making sure that the deal was structured in such a way to ensure those special cases like North Carolina, as you mentioned, were set up appropriately, had the right ownership structure, the right legal name. And we've seen where deals have closed and projects suddenly come to a screeching halt because they're no longer licensed in that state. And it's a total surprise to the buyers and sellers. And our state advisory team comes in and helps clean that up. So there's a lot out there, a lot of things that can happen that people don't realize. I run into people all the time, and you said pennies on the dollar, talking about the fees that you pay to all your advisors on M&A. I run into sellers all the time that they get sticker shock when they see what M&A consulting fees cost, and they kind of take this mindset of, I can get the same deal myself and save the money.
And we see people that do that. We also see some buyers that are new to the space, especially in the financial buyers, who sort of poo-poo the licensure stuff and say, well, it's working now, we'll deal with it post-closing. Well, that really works until you get a friendly letter from some licensure board. And remember, once you have a licensure problem in a state, you have to disclose that licensure issue on every state application in the United States thereafter. And if you're the name PE or AIA, your name is on it, and you're not a happy camper about that.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't committed a crime, and I have been to a disciplinary hearing in New York, okay, with the engineering board, the Board of Education. I will tell you, it is not the most pleasant place to be if you're a professional. So it just boggles my mind why people won't clean up matters beforehand, because they know it's coming down anyway.
Absolutely. George, is there anything we haven't discussed already that you would just like to share with AEC firm owners, whether buyers or sellers?
I guess I would say that people going into this a transaction, particularly on the sell side, so assuming maybe they've done a small acquisition, they're viewing it as like them against us. But we're trying to make an integrated marriage here. Unfortunately, the legal, the accounting, the financial, all have to be hurdles. But we're trying to bring people together. This is their profession. There's no need to make it a zero-sum game. Good buyers say, okay, how can we now address this topic, whether it's license, whatever it is. Okay. Some buyers are a little bit more them and us, okay, but that's to be expected. And we just got to keep in mind that at the end of the day, all the intermediaries go away. We don't typically get invited to the first anniversary party.
That's right.
Okay. We go on to the next deal. Some are gracious enough to have closing dinners or closing events or send some swag or whatever. But our job is to help you, the seller, or you, the buyer, accomplish your goal, which is to grow the firm through a external transaction and lay the groundwork for a positive integration of that firm, or maybe it's going to be a platform company. So it's not a them against us. Okay. Recently, somebody asked me, well, what do? You get the first draft of the documents and you redline it. I said, well, we don't anymore, because when you do that, A, it takes a lot of time, and B, you use a lot of red ink. So we have now gone to, here are the 12 major issues. And here's an issues list. And let's have everybody, and not the lawyers, not just the lawyers, and not just the tax folks. Let's get everybody on the phone. And let's understand that these are 12 topics that have to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can address them and resolve them, that doesn't mean, and I don't like buyers that say, I'll give on this issue. We're not giving on any issue. We're trying to resolve topics. We're going to be here today and gone tomorrow. People have now taken their professional career and moved it over to a different firm or a different venue. Okay, there's no going back now. So the idea is to come together in a meaningful, commercially reasonable, professionally enlightening way. Okay, and most folks want to work another 10 years. They're not here to cash out. No buyer today is going to spend this money and watch somebody leave in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Those days are gone. And with rollover equity, I tell my sellers, you want to be there when the rollover takes place. And that's 3 to 5 years, maybe 6. That's when the financial double hit comes from. And that's where you get some fulfillment maybe in growing a bigger firm. So we just look to counsel folks. We tell people this is commercially reasonable. You might not like it. You might have to sign a non-compete. You don't think you should, but that's the way it works when somebody writes you a check. And try to get folks to understand, what's a fair set of parameters to consummate a transaction.
Well, George, I love the way you talk about it's not us versus them. It's not a zero-sum game. I love that, especially in this AEC industry where culture really matters. And, that's where that marriage analogy is so applicable. Just like in a marriage, it doesn't behoove either side of the marriage partnership to get to the other side of the wedding and find out a surprise about each other, or that someone kind of suppressed the truth on something that's important. That doesn't tend to lead to a happy future marriage. Same thing in M&A when you're talking about buyers and sellers. Full disclosure, let people know everything that's important about both the buyer and the seller going through that process. Nobody needs to be surprised on the back side of this.
Right. Absolutely.
So, George, is there anything you would like to say as we close here, just about the Lawson and Weitzen team?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you having us on,
I
having me
appreciate you
on.
being here.
We're a team of we're a team of 7 folks within a 40-person law firm, and all we do is M&A and internal transition, buying and selling. We've been very fortunate to deal with a lot of wonderful people in this space, architects and engineers, environmental consultants. We get referrals. A lot of times we get referrals because we try to be seen and try to act in a business-like way and do what you want, which is typically to make something happen between 2 firms. We deal with big firms, small firms, big deals, small deals, and the size and shape of the deals we do are reflective really of just what's out there. Yeah, we do a lot of very big ones, but we do a lot of very small ones too, because there are a lot of very small deals. And the small deals don't mean they get small attention. They're just as important as big deals. We're not brokers. We work by the hour. We're trying to make things happen for whoever. And we try to take our professional expertise and understand what the goals are and try to help. And it's very rewarding when we get really nice notes afterwards from sellers and buyers. Thank you for helping us get through this stage. We've made a lot of friends. We get a lot of work from referrals because we've made friends along the way. And most of the deals are well received, and therefore people think of us in a positive way because we were somehow connected to a well-received event in their lives. And we treat every deal, fresh. We staff it appropriately, and our goal is to get what you want, which is to make a fair deal in a timely manner with these folks or whoever folks you've chosen. So we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your fine firm, and we go back a ways.
Well, George, thank you so much. And thanks for tuning in to AEC Unscripted, the Mergers and Acquisitions edition. I'm Jeff Adams, and it's been a pleasure guiding you through the legal aspects of M&A in the AEC space. Remember to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. And until next time, keep pushing forward.